Hello, everyone. This is, excuse me, I wanted to record a presentation of the material that we didn't get to on Monday night due to all the weird technical snafus we had. And I know that we were able to follow along with you viewing the slides independently, but with this material, I I didn't feel comfortable doing that, so I thought I would just wait and record it for you. So we're going to be talking about operant stimulus control in this presentation. Now, if you haven't done so, complete the Relias module on stimulus control first. We've talked about different antecedents. These were some questions I was going to do together in class, so we'll just for fun, we'll go through these right now. So an antecedent stimulus is present when the behavior is reinforced. An antecedent stimulus that is present when a behavior is reinforced is a or an, and which is correct? Well, you should have selected C, discriminative stimulus. An antecedent stimulus is present when a behavior is not reinforced is, and the answer to this is an S delta. An S delta is a cue or stimulus that's associated with extinction. Blank takes place when the behavior occurs in the presence of stimuli that are similar to an SD. And the answer you should have chosen there is generalization. Generalization is when you get a response to a stimulus that's similar to the one or the group of stimuli in which reinforcement occurred previously. Generalization is an important concept with reinforcement, and it's part of the foundation of how we learn. We learn to respond to things. For example, an example of generalization would be you teach a child to say doggy when you have a puppy, let's say, and then the kid sees a grown dog, a big dog that is a different breed, and says doggy. That's right, that's a doggy. Or the kid sees um, another puppy that looks different, and you're less likely to get generalization the more different the stimulus is from the original stimulus. Now you can also get generalization for incorrect concepts. That would be the toddler that sees a kitten and says doggy because they are overgeneralizing. They're calling everything with four legs and fur a dog. And what happens there is they haven't learned the critical features or essential elements that makes up the concept dog. So with the operant model of learning, we think of concepts as a collection of critical features. And you're gonna learn more about how to design instruction focusing on what are the critical concepts. Typically developing children generalize concepts pretty easily. We learn just in the course of interacting with our environment. Children with developmental disabilities and children on the autism spectrum, on the other hand, often have a lot of difficulty with generalization. Often this is because they attend to irrelevant features. They may focus on something that's the same in a number of instances. For example, I was teaching a kid years ago um, sight words, and he was focusing on these nuances of the cards. One card would have like a dog-eared corner or a smudge on it or a coffee stain, and he was tuning in into all those little elements. So he wasn't attending to the critical or relevant features in his learning, and we had to make changes to the way we were teaching him. A blank involves a relationship among antecedent stimulus, a behavior, and the consequence of the behavior. And which of these is correct? Well, that should be the three-term contingency, the antecedent, behavior, and consequence. And you're going to learn that we now actually consider the more complete model is the four-term contingency. The four-term contingency includes the motivating operation, the antecedent, the behavior, and the consequence. So what is stimulus control? Well, it's not quite controlling somebody. It's the really the extent that the environmental stimulus comes to control operant behavior. So you get stimulus control when you've learned to associate certain aspects of the environment with reinforcement and other aspects of the environment with extinction or punishment for in a specific situation. So, for instance, you learn that in my example with the Krispy Kreme donuts, when the red donut sign is on, that means if you go in and ask for hot donuts, you'll get hot donuts. When the red donut sign's off, that's an S delta. You can go in and you can ask for hot donuts, but that behavior is not going to result in getting hot donuts. You can get a cold donut or nothing at all. And then we also, when I used that example, I explained it in the context of motivating operations. That's basically, whether you want a donut to begin with. So to understand operant behavior more completely, you have to know the four-term contingency. But stimulus control is the extent to which an individual learns to respond in some situations and not others. And that occurs with us all the time. We're constantly emitting behaviors under certain circumstances because we know that those behaviors will be reinforced in those situations, and we don't engage in those behaviors when they have no chance of paying off for us. For example, my phone battery went dead the other day. So the dead battery, or the icon of the battery with the red line through it, um, that's an S delta for making phone calls. I may need to make a phone call. I could have the motivating operation, but I'm not going to try to make a phone call when my phone's telling me it's not going to operate. I mean, that would be wacky. So let's review a little bit about the concept of reinforcement. So when behavior is reinforced, when reinforcement occurs, and this applies to positive and negative reinforcement, several things are happening. You are learning, you experience the consequence, and in this instance, it's a consequence that is going to motivate you to engage in that behavior more in the future. But what you actually learn is the environmental cues or the discriminative stimuli that are present when that reinforcement is delivered. We learn those over repeated experiences. So over time, you learn the environmental cues or the situations that are going to signal the availability of reinforcement. And we change our behavior accordingly without even being aware of it. You don't have to consciously be aware of certain SDs or cues in your environment. You learn those through repeated experiences. And sometimes SDs occur in clusters, or there may be several SDs that need to be present at the same time to signal the availability of reinforcement. And the amazing thing is this can all happen without us really attending to it or being aware of it. We can, and it does happen to us all the time. Pay attention to the way you behave in certain situations, and you often will engage in behaviors automatically without even really thinking about them. And it's because that behavior has been brought under stimulus control. You experience those discriminative stimuli, and the motivating operations are present, and then before you know it, you're engaging in some behavior that's leading to some kind of reinforcement. In a week or so, we're going to learn about self-management. That's an important tool in changing behavior. And a big part of self-management is awareness training. That's making the individual aware of the behavior that he or she is actually engaging in and the cues to which they're responding. And that's a critical piece. And then the other part of that is teaching the person to monitor or record their own behavior, and then teaching them something else to do in those situations. So self-management, self-monitoring is a really fascinating set of tools. But it's based on this idea that with reinforcement, we're learning associations or connections with those antecedent stimuli that are present. Extinction, as we've said before, it's when a behavior that's been reinforced in the past is no longer reinforced. And when that happens, of course, we we experience the non-reinforcement, and it usually causes some kind of momentary escalation in our behavior that's called an extinction burst. But we also pay attention to those cues, to those environmental signals that are present. And what happens, let's say that some cues are always present when the behavior is not followed by reinforcement. Other cues are always present when the behavior is followed by reinforcement. And you see where I'm going here. Things that are present when the behavior results in reinforcement become SDs to us. They become discriminative stimuli. Environmental cues, stimuli that are in place when the behavior does not result in reinforcement become S deltas, and they signal to us that the behavior is not going to be followed by reinforcement. So what happens is we tend to engage in the behavior when the SDs are present, and then we stop engaging in the behavior when the SDs are not present or when the S deltas are present. And that's an example of stimulus control. For example, like I gave the phone example. Another one, sorry, I apologize. I'm going to go close the door. I'll give you an example that happened to me recently. You know that I do a lot of woodworking. One of the things I do is I make wooden bowls on a lathe, and to do that I need wood. So I asked, there's some tree trimmer folks in the neighborhood I've seen, and I approached them, this one group of people, a couple of times and asked them, if you ever run across any walnut or cherry or maple trees that you cut down and there's some nice chunks of wood, I would like to have them, and if you bring me some nice pieces of wood, I'll make a bowl for you. So there was this one group of people that I probably approached about 5 times and said that to, and they tell me they will, and then they just don't. There's another gentleman who I met, and I talked to him, and I mentioned that one time, and the other day he brought me these great big chunks of cherry that will make some bowls that are maybe 16 or 18 inches in diameter. So, and I'll get some nice bowls out of those. So I'm not going to ask the guys that don't reinforce me, but the gentleman that brought me the cherry wood, I'm gonna make some. I'm gonna make a nice nested bowl set for him to reinforce him for bringing me the wood, and then I'm gonna keep asking him. And so those situations happen to us all the time. We don't continue to engage in behavior that just doesn't pay off. Punishment, on the other hand, is when the behavior, we have positive and negative punishment. It's a presentation of something aversive or something that we value is removed contingent on a behavior, and then the result is our behavior stops occurring in the future. Just as there are discriminative stimuli that signal that a behavior will be reinforced, there also are discriminative stimuli for punishment, and it's abbreviated by an S with a superscript P for punishment. So that means it's a discriminative stimulus for punishment. Now this is different from an S delta. An S delta is a cue or stimulus that signals that a behavior will not result in reinforcement. An SP means that the behavior will actually result in punishment. So both an SP and an S delta behaviors are less likely to occur in their presence, but you'll get faster suppression of behavior with an SP. It's something where we might try out, behaviors that had been reinforced in the past. Even if an S delta is there, a behavior will occur sometimes, and sometimes the behavior still occurs if the discriminative stimulus for punishment is there, but it's much less likely. Punishment occurs as part of daily life. It's a natural phenomena, and of course people use it to try to decrease behaviors as well. Often when people are doing something that they're calling punishment, it actually doesn't function as a punisher. Sometimes it has no effect on a behavior, and then sometimes it actually increases a behavior. Like the research shows that suspending kids from school does not function as a punisher for most students for whom those interventions are used. Um, Yet, if you talk to people who suspend kids, very often they describe it as a punishment or consequence for behavior. So, it is a consequence because it follows a behavior. It's not a punisher unless it is associated with a reduction in behavior. So, an example of punishment that I experienced recently, let me see. Um, Happens all the time. Yeah, this morning, I was driving into work and I have a new thermal mug that my wife got me. She got one, she really liked hers a lot, so she got me one too. So I was going to a meeting today with a chancellor from another university. There was a group of us that sat in this meeting at lunch, so I knew that that was later in the day. So I was getting ready to go come in this morning, go into the office, and I filled up my mug with hot coffee and got in the car, but I didn't really attend to it. And when I screwed the lid on, so my first time I turned the cup up to take a drink, hot coffee just went all down the front of my shirt. So my behavior of haphazardly screwing on the coffee lid was punished. I'm, and it probably just one trial is going to be enough because I'm going to pay a lot of attention every time I screw that lid on now. Um, you better believe it. So, yeah, punishment has influences on our behavior. Now, punishment is not, we'll spend some time talking about it. It's overused, certainly in the field of education. Maybe not as much so as it was in the past, but it's still overused. Punishment has a huge weakness when it comes to changing behavior, and that is it doesn't teach someone what they're actually supposed to do. So any kind of punishment contingency that you use, it should come in only in the context of a very well designed program to teach and reinforce the appropriate behavior that you're looking for. And often when we teach and reinforce appropriate behaviors, we actually don't need to use punishment consequences to begin with. So as we've talked about before, the three-term contingency, and now we usually talk about the four-term contingency because we put motivating operation out in front. It's the antecedent, the behavior, and the consequence. Now, the antecedent in this instance is the SD, the discriminative stimulus. So what we typically think about or call antecedents are discriminative stimuli. There's another type of antecedent stimulus, and that is the motivating operation. It serves a different function or purpose than the discriminative stimuli. The SD signals if a behavior is going to result in reinforcement. The motivating operation affects the value of a reinforcer. So it has a different function in the four-term contingency. So here's some real quick examples. The phone rings or your phone plays a little, ringtone. You answer it. I probably need to update this example. You don't really you do pick up your phone if it's sitting on a table. You don't pick it up out of a cradle as in the olden days. And then you talk to somebody, or in my instance, you look at the number and it's some spam. I keep labeling more and more numbers as spam, and then I just put it down. So that's a good example of stimulus control, actually. So my phone rings. I look at the screen. Is it a number I recognize, or is it labeled as spam? If it's labeled as spam, that's actually an SD for punishment to me, because when I answer my phone and I get those recordings, that's really aversive to me. It annoys me, especially if I'm really busy or my hands are full of stuff and I try to answer my phone and it goes, "Hello, we have important information about your auto warranty." That just drives me nuts. So that's aversive. So that number that's weird looking is a discriminative stimulus for punishment for me. A number from someone I know or somebody that I want to talk to is an SD, because that's going to result in reinforcement. And then the phone not ringing at all is an S delta. You can engage in the behavior. I could pick up my phone and start talking if it doesn't ring, but that would serve no purpose and people would look at me weird, because that would be a weird behavior. And then the other example is a social situation of friends telling stories, or sometimes people laughing or not laughing, and You're more likely to tell jokes to people that laugh at your jokes. If people make weird faces, then no. I'll give you an example too of when I get emails about new books and material sometimes from publishers, and if I see something that I'm not interested in, it doesn't really relate to something I'm doing, but it looks like something that might be of interest to one of my colleagues. I usually forward those. I just say, hey, I got this in the mail. This looks like it might be something you find useful. And sometimes it is, and usually I don't hear from the person one way or another, but it just takes a second, and I appreciate it when people do that for me. If somebody sends me something that I might find useful, I appreciate that, and I usually try to tell them I appreciated you forwarding that to me. There was one person a year or so ago. I forwarded some materials to that person, and three times in a row, the person wrote back and said, did you look at this? This is based on blah, blah, blah. Or they had some problem with the material. And I like, no, I didn't look at it. It looked like the area that you're interested in. So I thought it might be of use to you. Of course, if, it's not. Anyway, that happened three times in a row. They wrote back and basically chastised me of my poor choice in sending the material. Well, I stopped sending stuff to them, and I do see things that now that I think probably they would be useful to them, but I never send them things anymore. So what's that an example of? Is that an example of behavior um, not being reinforced, or is it an example of punishment? You decide on that one. My behavior did decrease, but did it decrease because of a lack of reinforcement? Was it extinction, or was it punished? Um, I'm going to say it was punished because I found that distasteful and I didn't appreciate it. Again, it's I well, uh, it seemed odd to me that the person I was actually trying to help them. If the person didn't want to get the emails, then they could have said something that related to I appreciate that, but I usually see all this stuff as well, and you don't really need to forward it. I can't imagine actually telling that to somebody if they thought enough to forward something to me. At any rate, yeah, I thought it was aversive to me, so I stopped doing it. So, there's a concept that we're going to learn about called discrimination or operant discrimination. So as part of this overarching idea of stimulus control. So with discrimination, it means that you discriminate between situations where there's an SD and situations where there's an S delta. So when you behave differently in the presence of those different stimuli, you have learned to discriminate. This is a big part of what happens with associative learning of names. There are other ways you're going to learn that you can learn as humans. We have language that affects our learning, but you can teach individuals who don't have language the difference between the names of different things. They can learn that, and they learn it through associative learning and stimulus control. So if I'm teaching a really young child or a person with significant cognitive disabilities to receptively label different objects, let's say, a comb, a spoon, a fork, then I can teach them to discriminate between a fork and a spoon. And I do that by using a bunch of different examples. We're going to learn about um, different aspects of using of stimulus control. But to teach something like a fork, let's say that's simple, well, you've got to think about what is a fork. What defines a fork? Is it the size? Well, I've seen big forks and little forks. Is it the color? Well, I've seen metal forks that are silver. I've seen plastic forks that are all different colors. I've seen forks made out of wood. So it's not the color, it's not the material, but it's the shape. A fork has tines and it has a handle and it's typically flat. So I would need different examples of a fork. So if someone has language, you can just tell them that. You can say, well, this is a fork because it has tines and it has a handle. If someone doesn't have language, they can still learn the concept, but they have to learn it through stimulus control. And they learn it through repeatedly being exposed to examples of a fork and then something that's not a fork. And to make learning more effective and to teach the person to attend to the relevant or critical features, the non-example should match on all the non-critical features. So for example, if I had a fork and I was going to teach someone to touch the fork, when I say, touch the fork, then the non-fork should be the same color, it should be about the same size. And I'd probably start out with something that doesn't look anything like a fork. Because I'm going to use shaping here also. So, or stimulus fading is typically what this is called. So it might be, a marker that's the same color as a plastic fork, about the same size, or some other kind of tool. And then I'll have a metal fork with another object that's metal and the same color but doesn't look like a fork. And then I might have a white plastic fork and then something else is made out of white plastic. And on each of those occurrences, I'm going to prompt the person to touch the fork. Now what's going to happen is over those repeated trials, the person is going to learn to attend to what's the same across those trials or presentations. So what changes and what stays the same? Things that change, the person will learn, are not critical. They don't define the concept that you're teaching. So this will make a lot more sense when we look at it, and actually the 709 course is devoted, a big chunk of that course is devoted to teaching using stimulus shaping and stimulus control. So discrimination training is when you learn to engage in a behavior when you see the SD, when the SD is present. You don't even have to really be aware of it. If it's there. Now, of course, the more that you attend to it, learning is going to happen faster. So we tend to make, when we want to teach someone to perform a skill in certain situations, we make the SD stand out. So sometimes we'll use some kind of, we'll highlight it in some way or make it bigger or draw attention to it. That's another way of facilitating stimulus control. And then you don't engage in the behavior when the S deltas are present. And sometimes we even accentuate those and make those clear. An example here would be if I had a group of kids and I was trying to teach them to work in groups quietly, but then when we had whole class instruction, I wanted them not to speak unless they raised their hand. And then if we had free time, they could talk quietly to their friends. Well, suppose these were kids that had some learning challenges. How could I make the SDs more salient? Well, I could teach them a system. I could give each of those 3 expectations a code, and I could say, okay, voice level 1, and I'm going to put a big number 1 up at the front of the classroom. When you see the big 1 up here, it means that I'm talking to the whole class, and if you have a question or if you have something to say, you need to raise your hand first, and then I'll call on you, and then you speak. Let's practice that, class. And then you practice it, and you say, good job. Then you practice voice level 2. I have a big number 2 that I'm going to put up here. When you see the number 2 at the front of the classroom, it means you can talk quietly in your group about the work you're doing. But you need to be quiet enough that you're not bothering the group next to you. And what you talk about needs to be related to the work. You can't talk about, a video game that you got or something that you did after school. You've got to talk about what we're working on. So you practice that. And then you practice, if you see a 3, it means we have free time and you can talk to your friends, but you still need to be quiet enough that you're not going to disturb the other classrooms. Let's practice that. So that would be an example of you're creating an SD really, and then you're teaching the students to discriminate and you're teaching them different behaviors associated with each SD. So here's just a recap of these different terms. The SD is the discriminative stimulus. The S delta is the antecedent that's associated with extinction or non-reinforcement. So what you tend to get when you have stimulus control, the behavior occurs in the presence of the SD and does not occur in the presence of the S delta. It's supposed to highlight the next one. I'll just try to read it. So when Billy falls, well, this is kind of sexist. I actually pulled this example out of somewhere else. When Billy falls at soccer practice and Mom is there, he cries and Mom responds with attention. When Dad's there, he tells Billy to get back in the field. Be a man, Billy. Billy cries when he falls only when Mom's at soccer practice. Well, I've seen dads that are more likely to reinforce kids for falling, but hey. So in this case, Mom is the SD for crying and Dad is an S delta. And then the final example, Martha works in a group home for individuals with disabilities. Her supervisor comes around once an hour and praises her if she sees her interacting with clients. Martha interacts with the clients only when she hears her supervisor approach. So what's the SD there and what's the S delta? Well, the supervisor is the SD, and then the S delta would be the absence of the supervisor. This is just going through each of those and answering the questions, in which we've already done, so I'm going to fly right through them. So let's talk about an SD versus an establishing operation. So motivating operations, MOs, are divided into EOs and AOs. EOs are establishing operations. AOs are abolishing operations. Let's talk about establishing operations first. Establishing operations have two effects. They have a behavior altering effect and they have what's called a value altering effect. The behavior altering effect means that the presence of an EO, an establishing operation, it will evoke or cause an increase in behaviors that have been associated with getting access to a reinforcer in the past. For example, if I'm really hungry, I'm going to start engaging in behaviors that have been successful in getting food in the past. I'm going to look for a restaurant, or if I'm at home, I'm going to rummage through cabinets. I'm going to start doing that stuff. Also, an EO has a value altering effect. Once I get food, if that EO is strong, that food is going to function as a more powerful reinforcer. So it has that behavior altering effect. The behavior altering effect occurs before you actually access the reinforcer. The value altering effect occurs along with the reinforcer. And the value altering effect affects behavior in the future. The behavior altering effect affects behavior right now. They're both antecedent stimuli in that they both occur or are present before the behavior occurs. And both of them really are related to whether or not you engage in a behavior at any point in time. We've established that the SD can be there, but unless the motivation is there, unless that reinforcer has some value, you're not going to engage in the behavior. So you need both to actually facilitate or evoke a behavior occurring. Now that we've talked about EOs and antecedents, how they're different and how they're similar, let's look at how antecedents are different from consequences. Antecedents, both EOs and SDs, evoke behavior. They both alter the current probability that a behavior will occur. Behaviors more likely to occur in their presence, especially if you have a strong EO. So with EOs, you get that behavior altering effect. Consequences, reinforcers and punishers, are repertoire altering. In other words, they actually drive the behaviors that you can exhibit. Behaviors are shaped through reinforcement. So antecedents don't really cause behaviors. Sometimes I think it's misleading to call them triggers, although I use that language sometimes. But they're more, you learn with, especially with discriminative stimuli, are signals that a behavior is going to be reinforced, and then establishing operations affect the value of the reinforcer, and they have that um, they can elicit those behaviors that have been reinforced in the past. But even there, you have those behaviors in your repertoire, and in behavior analysts use the term repertoire to refer to all the behaviors or skills that person has in his or her arsenal of behaviors. So the behaviors that I have at my disposal to earn reinforcement, that's my repertoire. Well, your repertoire is built by consequences. The behaviors that are successful in obtaining reinforcers get strengthened. Behaviors that are not successful in reinforcement for extinction, or behaviors that result in punishment, are weakened. So consequences alter the future probability of behavior. Establishing operations, especially, they affect behavior right now, so they're different temporally. But consequences are really what drive behaviors. Consequences are what give SDs their strength. SDs only become SDs through their association with reinforcement or extinction or punishment. So in the operant world, consequences are the driving force behind our behavior. We talked a bit about generalization earlier. So generalization is the extent to which I'm going to engage in a behavior. Well, if I learn to engage in a behavior under one set of conditions, I'm likely to engage in that behavior in the future in similar situations. The more different the situations are from the situation in which I learned the behavior, the less likely I am to do it. That's called a generalization gradient. And it's just like a peak. So, picture like this outline of a roof of a house. Well, the peak of the roof is the exact situation in which you learn the skill. So, for example, if I'm going to teach a vocational skill to a young person with a disability, I used to do that. I worked with young adults and I taught them job skills. So if I was going to do that, I would, I'll give you an example. There was this one young man and I was teaching him to bag groceries. So I set up a simulation. He was going to get a job bagging groceries. So I had a table, and I had an old cash register, and I set up this little simulation that looked like a grocery store, and I had some groceries and different things that we'd picked up. So I just taught him to bag different things, and there were certain things he had to know, like you don't put a loaf of bread and then put like a six-pack of soda on top of it, or if or a carton of eggs, you don't put that in and put canned goods on top of it. So there were some of those things, and there were questions he needed to ask. Would you like paper or plastic? And then would you like your milk in a separate bag? Things like that. So I had the list of skills that he needed to learn. This was early in my career. I would have known better later. So I taught him to all those situations, all those things to say. I taught him the stuff to do, and then he went to the job site and he just totally messed up. He was not able to bag stuff. He put like bread in a bag and then put like a case of dog food on top of it, and he didn't ask the questions or anything. So he didn't generalize any of those skills. Well, what I needed to do is I could have started with a simulated situation, but I needed to actually go into the real situation and teach him there. I needed to model the skills there, and I needed to use chaining and teach him the sequence of skills in that setting, in that situation. And then I needed to teach him to vary things more. I didn't use a lot of variation. I just taught him one scenario, but I needed to, what do you do if you're bagging groceries and then you say, would you like paper or plastic? And the person says, I don't care. Well, then you got to pick one, but he probably would not have known what to do. He would have asked them again, maybe, and they would have gotten annoyed with him. Another thing that he did is he would, if someone asked him how he was doing, or how are you doing today, he would start telling them, in incredible detail. What, I got up this morning, I had cereal for breakfast, then I had a glass of milk, and then I went and I packed my lunch for today. For lunch, I have a cream cheese sandwich with olives on rye bread, and that's my favorite sandwich. So you get the picture. So I had to teach him those other social skills that went along with bagging groceries. So a simpler model would be, let's say that you teach someone sight words, and I teach them the word out. Like you would see if you went to, there's stores in and out. So OUT out. Um, and then I would ask them to touch the word out. They're going to get words correct. They're probably going to overgeneralize, and words that have three letters and start with the letter O, they might also pick. So there you can get overgeneralization as well. So here's an example. You get the SD, the parent makes a request, the child follows a request, and the child gets praise. So then you repeat that over time, and then the kid is more likely to follow directions in different situations. The more different requests you make in different situations, the more likely you can count on the kid following your direction if it's a direction they've never heard before. And of course, you can also get extinction. So, if you don't follow a reinforcement, then you're not going to get somebody following the direction. Discrimination training is when we set up a scenario so that we're actually teaching someone to discriminate between different concepts. So in this case, it would be a big dog, and then the kid says dog. And that's right, Johnny, that's a doggy. Good job. And then there's a pony, and the kid says dog, and then you don't praise them, but then you do a correction. Now by correction, what I'll be, no, that's not a pony. That's not a dog. No, no, it would just be, no, that's a doggy. I mean, apparently I don't know the difference. No, that's called a pony. It's not a doggy. This is a doggy. This is a pony, or a goat, or a cow, or any other animal. So you're likely to get the kids saying dog in response to those things because they haven't learned the concept. They've learned anything with four legs and fur, I'm all over its body, I'm going to call a dog. So discrimination is the repeated exposure to different dogs, like big dogs, little dogs, dogs with short hair, dogs with long hair, and then they learn the critical features, what's relevant to being a dog, and you can have all kinds of dogs. So that would be generalization. If you teach me with a Shih Tzu, I'm not automatically going to be able to recognize a Great Dane as a dog. Or if you show me a Chihuahua, you teach me with a Chihuahua and a Shih Tzu, or a toy Cocker Spaniel, then that person's probably not going to be able to identify a Great Dane and a Mastiff and a Saint Bernard as a dog. So it's with repeated exposure and training that you get discrimination training. So discrimination and generalization, think of them as being on a continuum. Discrimination is the extent to which you can be specific about correctly labeling concepts. Generalization is the extent to which you can identify similar things based on their characteristics. So in other words, if I had 10 different examples of a dog, let's say a Cocker Spaniel, a German Short-Hair Pointer, you get the idea. And then I have a breed of dog that was not included in the training examples. Let's say that it's a Bichon. You're like, what's this? That's a doggy. Good job. Well, that wasn't a dog the person's ever seen before, but because I included a lot of examples in my teaching, the person was able to generalize. Discrimination would be being able to identify a dog versus a cat. So, this is a dog, and then the person doesn't know what a cat is, and they know that's not a dog. So, that's how we all learn to discriminate among different things. So this is an example of generalization training. So for SD, we need to have a range of examples that cover the range that exists for whatever the concept is. So in the case of dogs, we need dogs of different sizes. We need dogs with different hair length. We need dogs that have different body shapes. A pug has a very different body shape than a Saluki. They're one of them's got a little, brachiocephalic pushed in face, and then the other has a long snout. They don't even look like the same species. They're both dogs though. So if we teach each one of those examples, we're more likely to get generalization across those examples. So to contrast these two parts of the same continuum, discrimination occurs rather when the behavior occurs in the presence of a specific SD. Generalization happens when the person engages in the behavior in the presence of similar SDs. So they're part of the same process. I see them as a continuum. You've got discrimination on one end of the continuum and generalization on the other. These are just some terms that you should be able to provide examples of at this point in time. So look these over, and if anything's giving you any trouble, it may be something that you want to look at again. But by this point, you should be able to readily give an example of any one of these concepts. These would be good quiz items. That's a hint.